Hello there. Welcome to Storytime with Nannie. The story I'd like to read is called Monster in the Lake by Julie Helm, illustrations by Debbie Carey. The story is part of the Lost Monster Tales series, in which there were 5 stories. Monster in the Lake. Brigham scrunched up his face and stared at the large, strange ripple that suddenly appeared in the lake. He'd seen the same ripple moments earlier when he and his family first arrived at Bell Canyon Reservoir. Just when he was getting ready to say something, it had vanished. He couldn't help wondering how a ripple that big could disappear so suddenly. Now it was back, and it smelled worse than Nick's stinky socks. So he picked up a rock and threw it at the water. The rock plunked into the center of the ripple. Water splashed, and the back of a hairy animal rose to the surface for a few seconds and then dropped out of sight. Brigham frowned and backed away, making certain he pulled his younger brother Nick with him. "Dad," Brigham yelled, "come quick, I saw something." "I heard that splash," his dad called out. "I told you boys to stay out of the water." "That wasn't us," said Brigham. Brigham's dad dropped the tent poles he was twisting together and walked down a slight incline to the edge of the lake water. "What did you see, Brigham?" he asked, and looked first one direction and then the other. "A big green lumpy thing," said Brigham. "It splashed and then it was gone." "It was a scary monster," said Nick. His dad glanced at Nick. "Don't exaggerate." Brigham shrugged. "He wasn't exaggerating." "I don't see anything," interrupted his dad. "Where did it go?" "I told you." "It sank," Brigham said. Brigham's dad arched an eyebrow, looking doubtful. "You're sure you're not just kidding me?" he asked. Brigham shook his head hard. "No." He turned and pointed at Nick, who was standing next to him. "You heard Nick. He saw it too." Nick nodded excitedly. "Uh-huh. It was real ugly." His dad folded his arms and looked from Brigham to Nick. "Boys, are you telling me the truth?" Brigham rolled his eyes and pouted. "You don't have to believe me, but Nick and I saw something spooky in the water." He folded his arms across his chest and glanced out at the lake water that appeared eerily calm for now. "We did that," said Nick. Brigham's dad studied the calm water for a moment longer. Brigham could tell what his dad was thinking, that nothing out of the ordinary was moving beneath the surface. No big splashing sounds, no ripples, nothing. "Must have been a fish," his dad finally said. "A fish?" said Brigham in a surprised voice. He didn't think that what he and Nick saw was any old fish. It was too big to be a fish. "Nuh-uh," was all he said then, knowing that he sounded disappointed, but not caring. "It didn't smell like a fish. It smelled bad, like a dead animal." Nick nodded and plugged his nose. "Like the dump." His dad shrugged. "Sorry, I don't know what else to tell you. It had to be a fish. This lake is full of them this time of year." Nick stared out at the lake. "I want to catch one. Can we go fishing now, Dad?" His dad turned and began walking up the incline to their weekend campsite. "I've got to finish setting up our camp first. Then we can go. Come away from the water, boys." "Brigham, you and Nick follow Dad," came their mom's voice from camp. "I don't want you near the water when Daddy and I aren't around. You know the rule." Brigham scowled at Nick. "You doofus," he whispered. "You want to get eaten? Anything that big could bite you in two, and that would ruin our trip. You don't really want to catch whatever was out there." Nick shook his head. "No, But Dad said it was a big fish. It wasn't a fish. Brigham leaned toward his brother and snapped his jaws like an alligator. It was something else. He and Nick walked up the incline and stood by their mom. She was helping prepare their camp for the weekend, too. She already had a fire going in the fire pit and was staring inside one of the ice coolers filled with food they brought for their trip. "We won't jump in the water," said Nick, and wrapped his arms around his mother's legs. "Nick, I know you and Brigham wouldn't ever jump in the water on purpose. I also know you can swim, but accidents can happen. What if one of you fell in the lake and Daddy and I weren't there? You could drown. The water's a lot colder than a swimming pool. It's better if you stay away completely, unless you've got one of us with you." "Nick and I wouldn't get close to the water anyway," said Brigham. "Something splashed." "He saw a lake monster in the water," interrupted Nick, unable to contain himself. "Dad says it's just a fish," said Brigham, kicking at the dirt beneath his shoe. "But I think—" "It was just a fish," said their mom. She closed the cooler, then reached down and pulled a Dutch oven out of their camping chest and set it on the card table they only used when they camped. "That's why we're here, to go fishing, remember?" She playfully rubbed the top of Brigham's head and gave the boys a teasing smile. "A huge fish," said Nick, stretching his arms out as wide as they would go. "Nick," said Brigham, "I'll tell her." "It was big, Mom. It was so freaky," said Brigham. "You guys are letting your imaginations run wild," his mom said. She pointed to a couple of mitts and a baseball laying on the ground near their truck. "I need to start dinner. If I were you, I'd go play catch over there." She targeted a grassy area between several pine trees that looked big enough for two boys to throw a ball back and forth to each other. Brigham couldn't help it if what he saw in the water didn't feel right. It gave him the creeps. His gut told him it wasn't a fish at all, in spite of what his dad said. He wanted to tell his mom he thought they might be in danger, but it was obvious his mother wasn't worried about it either. She didn't act worried, not if she could still fix dinner. She hadn't even glanced once in the direction of the lake. So why argue? Maybe he was wrong. It wouldn't be the first time. Besides, baseball sounded fun to Brigham. He loved throwing balls. Actually, he loved throwing anything. It would distract him from that stupid thing he saw in the water. "Okay," he said, and reached for Nick's hand. "Let's go play some ball." Nick quickly stepped away from him. "But I want to fish," he said, and he tugged his mom's hand in the direction of the lake. Mom frowned at Nick. "You go fishing without us, and you'll be sorry. You need to wait, or the monster in the lake will grab you. It's got a big mouth and long, sharp teeth, and it's always hungry." Nick froze and then glanced at Brigham. "There is a monster in the lake?" Eyes round, their mother hunched her back and looked like she did when she read them a scary story. She spit on the ground, looked to each side of her, and held a finger to her mouth before she began to whisper. "It doesn't bother anyone, though, except children who play in the water without their mom's and dad's permission. It watches, and it knows when children are alone. So wait for Daddy and I, okay? And it won't eat you." She turned Nick around and pushed him toward Brigham. "Now go play." Nick looked scared. Goosebumps rolled down Brigham's arms as he stared open-mouthed at his mom. Had she seen something swimming in the water after all? "There's a monster?" His mother shook her head. "No, Brigham, there's no monster." She laughed like she'd just told a funny joke, but her jokes were never as funny as she thought. "I was just kidding, you guys. I want you to wait until Daddy and I get the camp set up. Then we can get out our fishing poles and the tackle box and fish. That's all. No monsters." She clapped her hands like she did when she wanted them to hurry up. "We're here to have fun." Brigham rolled his eyes. Okay, he said, and walked over to their mitts and the ball. "Wait for me," said Nick. Brigham could hear his younger brother's disappointment. He wanted to fish real bad too, but he and Nick would have to wait. As they picked up their mitts and put them on, Brigham could have sworn he heard another splash. He decided to ignore it. Maybe it was just a big fish, and he had absolutely nothing to worry about. It didn't take Brigham and Nick long to get bored throwing the ball to each other. Nick kept throwing the ball at the pine trees instead of him and laughing, and Brigham got sick of chasing it. They even took turns tossing the ball as high as they could throw it. Any other time would have been fun, but this was supposed to be a fishing trip, and Brigham was ready to fish. Maybe there was a big trout out there just waiting for him to catch it. He would help his dad fillet it, give it to his mom, and then she could wrap it in bacon and fry it up for dinner. He could taste it already. He glanced over to where his mom and dad were and noticed them sitting on the back of the truck together. His dad didn't even have his fishing hat on yet. Instead, he had his arm around his mom and was talking to her. They didn't look any more ready to go fishing than they did half an hour ago. It isn't fair, he thought. His dad suddenly kissed his mom and then whispered something in his mom's ear. She slapped him on his chest and laughed. His dad laughed and kissed her again. His mom and dad laughed all the time. They were fun people. His dad jumped with him and Nick on their trampoline in their backyard, bladed with them on the sidewalks in their neighborhood, swam with them at Manresa Beach the summer they visited the ocean, and played with them whenever he wasn't working. Brigham smiled. His dad liked their toys as much as they did. They even played computer games together when Mom said it was okay. Brigham studied his mom for a moment. She was real awesome, too. He loved to listen to her sing. She taught him and Nick songs that were fun to sing. His mom read adventure stories to them every night before he and Nick went to bed. She helped him do his homework and fixed his favorite meals, stuff like pizza, quesadillas, and spaghetti. His mom played with them all the time, too. He loved his mom and dad. But this was a fishing trip, and they were all supposed to be fishing, not kissing. "Brigham," said Nick from behind him, "catch." Brigham spun on his heels and for the first time that day caught the ball. "Good throw," he called to Nick. He tossed the ball a couple of times in his mitt, aimed, and then threw it back, easy-like, so that Nick could catch the ball too. But Nick missed it. Whoosh! The ball sailed past Nick, hit a pine tree, and rolled right up to where the fishing poles, the tackle box, and his dad's fishing hat lay on the ground. Surprised, Brigham walked over to the ball. Nick followed him. Brigham hadn't seen the fishing gear or hat lying there before. His dad must have set them there a few minutes ago. His heart beat a little faster. Maybe his parents were done kissing. A grin spread across Brigham's face. He dropped the mitt he was holding. "Nick, you know what this means?" Nick shook his head, but Brigham could tell by the look in Nick's eyes that he wanted to know what it meant. "It means," began Brigham, "that Mom and Dad are ready to take us fishing." "Yippee," said Nick. Then Brigham got a great idea. "Nick, you and I could probably carry this fishing gear down to the lake shore for them." Nick jumped up and down and clapped his hands. "Yeah, we could surprise them." Brigham hesitated for a moment. Mom and Dad had both told them not to go down to the water without them. Would it be wrong to carry the fishing gear down to the shore if they were helping, though? Nick bent down and picked up a couple of fishing poles. "Come on, Brigham." "Mom and Dad told us to stay away from the water," Brigham said, wearing an expression that told Nick he was now a little worried about his great idea. "We won't get in the water. We'll just carry the fishing gear down there," said Nick. "I'm going to do it." He turned and began walking down the incline toward the shore. Brigham shrugged. He might as well, too. He'd make certain that Nick stayed out of the water. If anything did happen, he was a much stronger swimmer than his brother. Besides, Mom and Dad would probably be down any moment. Anticipating the fun they were all going to have, Brigham picked up the tackle box and his dad's fishing hat and followed Nick down. Things changed, however, when they got down there and set the poles and tackle box near the shore. Nick turned over a big rock for fun, and Brigham saw the biggest fishing worm he'd ever seen, wiggling in the damp dirt. "That sucker is huge," he told Nick. He picked it up by one end and felt it wiggling between his fingers. Nick scrunched up his face. "Gross. What are you going to do with it?" he asked. "Dad would stick it on a fishing hook and throw it in the lake," said Brigham. "Let's do it," he said. "I want to fish." "Everyone knows you want to fish, Nick," said Brigham, and he glanced up the incline. Why were Mom and Dad taking so long? He and Nick had waited all day to go fishing. He wanted to see if he could catch a fish, maybe even the fish that had caused that big ripple he had seen earlier. Yeah, that would be great. "Hand me Dad's pole," he said to Nick, and tore the worm into 2 juicy pieces. In his excitement, Nick nearly poked Brigham in the eye with the end of the pole, but he finally managed to give it to him. Brigham opened the tackle box and got out a hook and lead weights. He attached the hook and weights to the fishing line, just like his dad had taught him. Then he stuck the worm on the hook, sticking it through 3 times so it couldn't wiggle itself free. "Stand back," he told Nick when he was ready, and released a little more line for his cast. He held the button down on the reel and swung his arm in a big arc. Zip! Sailed the line. It flew through the air and landed several yards out in the lake. Nick jumped up and down. "Wow," said Nick. "I want to try." "Wait a few minutes first," Brigham told him, "to see if we get a bite. Then you can do it too." Brigham put a finger to his mouth and motioned for quiet. Nick nodded, and Brigham knew he understood. They stood very still and waited. Their dad had taught them how important it was to make as little noise as possible when they fished. If you weren't quiet, you chased all the fish away. Brigham was having loads of fun, Nick too, until that bad smell suddenly came back, and Brigham wished he wasn't so close to the water. Then they heard it, a splash, then a big kerplunk. Brigham forgot about the bad smell. A fish was out there swimming around. It sounded like it was close. It had to be a fish. But where was it? Brigham reeled in a little line, hoping the movement would snag the fish. Then something tugged on his line so hard that it almost jerked the pole out of his hands. "Yikes!" Nick shouted suddenly. Several big ripples rose in the water and moved their way. Brigham stared in disbelief. A green lumpy thing rose up in the middle of the ripples and sprayed water everywhere. A gurgling, deep growl erupted from the surface, and Brigham knew without doubt that whatever they were watching was no fish. Brigham and Nick screamed. "Ah! It's the lake monster!" shouted Nick. Brigham tried to quickly reel in his line, but something tugged hard on it again. He almost fell over. "Nick," he cried, "don't leave me. This thing's got a hold of my line." Brigham began backing up. "Hurry! Grab the pole." Nick grabbed the pole, and together they pulled on it. "Reel it in," Nick shouted at Brigham. "I'm trying," said Brigham. "Don't let go." Brigham and Nick pulled and strained and still couldn't free their line. They pulled until they were out of breath and their hands ached. The green lumpy thing thrashed right and left in the water. "Grr, grr, grr," it growled angrily. Brigham's heart nearly stopped when the monster raised its ugly head up and looked at them. Green scales covered its body and shimmered like multicolored marbles in the water. Its head reminded him of an ugly horse. Its eyes were the bright green of his parakeet back home, with narrow black slits that ran down their middle, and a yellow and brown tangled mane curled down its neck. It opened its mouth and let out a terrible bellow that shook the ground where they were standing, and then slapped the water with a long, forked tail. Water splashed everywhere. Brigham tried to scream, "Run!" but nothing came out of his mouth. The only thing he could do was stare at the sharp, jagged teeth that hung from the monster's open jaws. Teeth that could tear Nick and him to pieces if it wanted. They'd be fish chum. It growled again, "Grrr, grrr, grrr," and snapped at them with giant jaws. Then it gave another terrible bellow and dove back into the lake. "Dad!" Nick yelled, but his voice sounded too weak. Brigham knew their parents wouldn't hear, so he took another breath and finally forced enough air out of his mouth to call out, "Dad, we're in trouble! Help us!" Brigham and Nick tugged on the line until their feet started sliding into the water, and Brigham realized that the green lumpy monster thing was too strong for him and Nick. It spun around and began swimming away from them, the line still hooked in its mouth. Jumping grasshoppers! They should have run when they had the chance. He was going to lose Dad's pole. He knew that now. It was either save Nick and him and forget about the pole, or hang on to Dad's pole and maybe get eaten. He didn't want to be this slimy thing's dinner. "Nick, let go," he shouted. "Drop the pole!" But Nick didn't hear him. He was concentrating too much on tugging and pulling on the fishing pole. Where was his dad? "Nick!" he yelled again. But before he could finish what he was about to say, the green lumpy monster dragged him and Nick into the water. Splash! They bobbed through the water so fast they didn't sink. Cold lake water went up Brigham's nose and into his mouth. He could barely breathe. Brigham knew the same thing was happening to Nick. He was more scared than he had ever been in his entire life. They had to let go of the pole. Had to. The green forked tail rose out of the water again and slapped back into the lake, barely missing their heads. Brigham tried to call out Nick's name, but there was just too much water in his mouth, and he kept choking. Yet he had to do something, and fast. Before he could chicken out, he let go of the pole and grabbed Nick by the waist, hoping the added weight would loosen Nick's grip on the pole. But Nick was too afraid. Instead of letting go, he hung on tighter. So Brigham hung on. He wasn't letting go without his brother. He squeezed Nick's stomach and tried to pull, but nothing happened. Their bodies kept flailing and skipping through the water like they were buoys behind a boat. His arms ached, and he was almost out of breath. He gritted his teeth and tried one last time to raise his head high enough out of the water to cry out, "Let go! Nick will drown!" he finally shouted. Nick must have heard him because he let go, and they rolled and tumbled through the water and finally stopped. Brigham wanted to shout, but he couldn't. He was too busy spitting out water, struggling for breath, and holding Nick up while kicking his feet, trying to keep them afloat. "Hang on, Nick. Hang on," he told his brother. "I've got you." Nick choked and spit out water too. Brigham glanced across the water, but there were no more ripples. The lake monster had disappeared. For the moment, all Brigham could feel was relief. If he hadn't let go, he and Nick would be at the bottom of the lake right now. When Brigham was nearly out of breath, and he could feel his fingers slipping, a motorboat sped up beside him and Nick. "Dad! Mom!" Brigham said when he saw who was in the boat. He spit out another mouthful of lake water and began crying. When the boat stopped, his dad reached down and pulled Nick out of the water first, handed him to his mom, and then he pulled Brigham out. Nick kept coughing and spitting up stinky lake water. When he could breathe better, he began crying, and for once, Brigham was glad because he knew that meant Nick would be okay. The old man who had driven the boat gave his mom a couple of holey blankets to wrap them in. They smelled like boat oil and mothballs, but it felt good to be cocooned in their warmth, even though he was soaking wet. His mom held Nick tight enough to squeeze the air out of him, but he just closed his eyes and leaned against her. The man pulled a couple of life jackets out from a storage bin. He handed Nick and Brigham one. "Put these on." Mom helped Nick get into his jacket and then cocooned him again with the blanket. Brigham put on his own. Dad threw the blanket over his shoulders. "Get us out of here," he told the man. His dad sat next to him and draped an arm around his shoulders, tugging him closer. The man nodded and pushed the throttle forward as far as it could go. The boat lurched and cut through the water like they were being chased in a spy movie. The man kept scanning the lake, turning his head right and left like he was looking for something he didn't really want to find. Brigham knew that he was looking for the lake monster, but no one saw anything. Brigham glanced at his dad, and his face tightened in confusion. His dad sat quietly watching him. "Why didn't you come help us when we called?" he asked through chattering teeth. His dad sighed loudly, glanced at his mom, and then turned back to him wearing an "I'm so sorry" face. "Your mom had to go to the bathroom. We took a quick trip to the outhouse." "We came as soon as we could," his mom said, and squeezed him extra hard. "We're so sorry." Brigham nodded but didn't say a word. Nick didn't say anything either. "That there was the biggest doggone fish I ever saw," the man driving the boat told them while they bumped across the lake and water kept spraying in their faces. "And I've been fishing in this lake for nearly 50 years. "I think I'd have to agree with you," said Brigham's dad. No one else spoke after that. The man stopped the boat at the water's edge near their campsite. "I'm going to report what we saw this afternoon to the ranger," he told them as Brigham and Nick removed their blankets and life jackets. When the boat quit bobbing, the man jumped over the side into the shallow water and held out his arms for Nick. His mom hesitated, then handed him Nick reluctantly, like she didn't want to, but knew it was the only way to get him down. She climbed out of the boat and reached for him as soon as her feet hit the shore. "No, I want down," Nick told Mom. "Honey, you sure?" asked Mom. "I don't mind." Nick nodded. He still didn't feel much like talking. Brigham couldn't blame him. Brigham and his dad jumped off the boat next. The man shook Dad's hand, but glanced right at Brigham. "You're lucky I decided to come fishing today," he told them. Brigham watched as his mom and dad thanked the man for saving them. His dad shook the man's hand again. "We'll never be able to repay you," his mom told him. Her voice sounded hoarse. She waded over and gave the man a big hug, like she was squeezing a giant orange. Before she'd even let go, Brigham saw the man staring out at the water, like a kid staring at an open cookie jar. Brigham could tell The man wasn't thinking about his mom hugging him. His eyes were too glassed over. He was still thinking about the lake monster they had all seen. Brigham noticed a fishing pole and tackle box in the boat, and suddenly hoped the man was telling the truth. If he thought he was going to go back out there and try to catch that lake monster, he'd be fish bait. Having a boat wouldn't make any difference. Brigham shuddered. The man said goodbye and climbed back into his boat. He pushed the throttle forward all the way again and sped off, like he was already late for the next place he wanted to be. Brigham's dad looked at each of them. "Let's get out of here," he said, and punched Brigham softly in the shoulder. Mom grabbed Nick's hand, and they walked up the incline to their campsite. Working together, his family packed their belongings in a lot less time than it took to set them up. They left Bell Canyon Reservoir that very evening in their truck, before sunset. They didn't even get to sleep in their new tent. Brigham didn't feel bad, though. He wanted to sleep in his own bed. He knew Nick did, too, because Nick always wanted to do the same things as him. And he was tired, more tired than he had ever been in his entire life. Nick, too. His mom and dad didn't mention the green lumpy lake monster much after that, at least not in front of him and Nick. Brigham was pretty certain it upset his dad more than his dad wanted to admit. When his mom did talk about it on rare occasions, when Nick and Brigham coaxed her, she refused to call it a lake monster. She said monsters don't exist. Something must have popped in her brain, Brigham decided. Even after what she had seen that day in the lake, she still insisted it was probably an overgrown fish with a long tail. But she hadn't seen it raise its ugly horse head out of the water like he and Nick had. So Brigham couldn't blame her for not really believing in the lake monster. Maybe deep down, she knew it was a monster, but was too scared to admit it. Brigham's family never went fishing in the Bell Canyon Reservoir again that he could remember. Oh, they went fishing all right. They used their new tent and lanterns, camping table, Dutch oven, and the rest of their equipment because they really enjoyed camping. His family fished in rivers, in deep streams, and a few other lakes, but they never, ever, ever fished anywhere near Bell Canyon again. And no matter how old he got, Brigham tried not to disobey his parents again. It just wasn't worth the trouble he got himself into. Nick either.